Japan was stunned as American torpedoes began striking with ruthless accuracy part I. Years of deadly frustration after years of failures. One perfect weapon changed everything. Lieutenant Commander Jake Razor Sullivan gripped the controls of his TBF Avenger as he lined up for another torpedo run. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't carrying a death sentence under his wings. He was carrying vindication. The Mark 13 torpedo hanging beneath his aircraft had been redesigned, retested, and finally perfected after 3 years of American air crews dying for nothing. It was October 1944, and Torpedo Squadron 18 was preparing to launch from the USS Intrepid somewhere in the Philippinesia. The squadron had been reformed twice already, once after the massacre at Midway, and again after the catastrophic losses during the Guadalcanal campaign. Most of the original pilots were dead, killed not by Japanese fighters or anti-aircraft fire, but by their own weapons. The Mark 13 torpedo had been a disaster of such magnitude that it bordered on criminal negligence, and every man in VT-18 knew it. Sullivan remembered his first combat mission 2 years earlier, flying off the USS Hornet during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. He'd made a perfect approach on a Japanese heavy cruiser, dropping his Mark 13 from the optimal altitude and distance according to the manual. The torpedo had hit the water, armed properly, and ran straight and true toward its target. Then, at the moment of impact, it had simply bounced off the cruiser's hull like a rubber ball, its contact pistol failing to detonate the 600-pound Torpex warhead inside. That was the story of the early war. American torpedo bombers making suicidal attacks through walls of anti-aircraft fire, only to watch their weapons malfunction at the crucial moment. The Mark 13 had 3 major problems that made it nearly useless. It was too fragile and would break apart when dropped from safe altitudes. Its contact pistol was unreliable and often failed to detonate, and its gyroscopic guidance system was so sensitive that it frequently sent torpedoes in wild circles instead of toward their targets. The human cost had been staggering. At the Battle of Midway, Torpedo Squadron 8 had been wiped out almost to the last man, with only Ensign George Gay surviving to tell the tale. Their Mark 13s had performed so poorly that not a single hit was scored on Japanese ships, despite the incredible courage of the aircrews who delivered them. The same story was repeated at Guadalcanal, where entire squadrons of TBF Avengers were shot down making low-level torpedo runs that accomplished nothing. But now, in late 1944, everything had changed. The Bureau of Ordnance had finally admitted the Mark 13's failures and undertaken a complete redesign of the weapon. The new version featured a stronger air vessel that could withstand higher altitude drops, a magnetic influence exploder that would detonate the warhead when it sensed the magnetic field of a ship's hull, and improved gyroscopes that kept the torpedo running straight and true. Lieutenant Junior Grade Tommy Brooklyn Kowalski was one of the new pilots, fresh from training in Florida and eager to prove himself. Unlike the veterans like Sullivan, Kowalski had never experienced the frustration of watching a perfectly aimed torpedo fail to explode. To him, the Mark 13 was simply the weapon they used to sink Japanese ships. He didn't carry the psychological scars of watching friends die for weapons that didn't work. "Skipper, what's the real story with these new fish?" Kowalski asked as they prepared for the pre-flight briefing. The instructors back at Pensacola said they were finally reliable, but everybody knows instructors lie. Sullivan looked at the young pilot, remembering when he'd been that eager and naive. "Brooklyn, I've dropped 23 torpedoes in combat. Exactly 2 of them exploded when they were supposed to." He paused, watching Kowalski's face change as the implication sank in. "But the word from the test pilots is that the new Mark 13s are running hot, straight, and normal. We're about to find out if that's true." The briefing that morning was unlike any Sullivan had attended in 3 years of combat flying. For the first time, the intelligence officers weren't making excuses for weapon failures or adjusting tactics to compensate for unreliable torpedoes. Instead, they were planning coordinated attacks that assumed the Mark 13s would actually work as designed. "Gentlemen, today we're going after a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce their garrison at Leyte," announced Commander Harrison, the air group commander. "Intelligence indicates 6 transports escorted by 2 heavy cruisers and 4 destroyers. The convoy is approximately 200 miles northwest of our current position, making 12 knots on a southeasterly heading. The target was exactly the kind of heavily defended convoy that had proven nearly impossible to attack with the old Mark 13s. The Japanese had learned to concentrate their anti-aircraft fire and fighter cover around their most valuable ships, creating a gauntlet of steel that had decimated American torpedo squadrons throughout 1942 and 1943. But with reliable torpedoes, the tactical equation changed completely. The new Mark 13s have been tested extensively in both live-fire exercises and combat operations. Commander Harrison continued. Reliability is running at approximately 85%, which is better than any torpedo in our inventory. More importantly, the magnetic influence exploder means you don't need direct hits. The warhead will detonate when it passes under the target's keel, potentially breaking the ship's back. Sullivan felt a surge of excitement that he hadn't experienced since his first combat mission. For 3 years, American torpedo bombers had been fighting with one hand tied behind their backs, forced to make suicidal attacks with weapons that rarely worked. Now, finally, they had a weapon that could justify the terrible risks they took every time they flew into combat. The psychological impact on the squadron was immediate and profound. Pilots who had grown cynical and fatalistic about their chances suddenly began talking about targets they could hit and ships they could sink. The maintenance crews worked with renewed enthusiasm, knowing that their efforts might actually result in successful attacks instead of futile gestures. Chief Petty Officer Mike Wrench O'Brien had been maintaining torpedo bombers since before Pearl Harbor, and he'd watched too many good pilots die for weapons that didn't work. "I've been in this business for 15 years, he told his crew as they loaded the new Mark 13s onto the Avengers. "I've seen every kind of ordnance malfunction you can imagine. But these new fish are different. The test results didn't lie. We finally have a torpedo that works." The Mark 13 Mod 4, as it was officially designated, represented the culmination of 3 years of desperate engineering work. The air vessel had been completely redesigned with stronger materials and better shock absorption. The contact pistol had been replaced with a magnetic influence exploder that was virtually foolproof. The gyroscopic guidance system had been rebuilt from scratch with improved stability and reliability. Perhaps most importantly, the new torpedo could be dropped from altitudes up to 300 feet, allowing pilots to avoid some of the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The old Mark 13 had required drops from 50 feet or less, forcing pilots to fly through the heaviest defensive fire at the most vulnerable moment of their attack run. As Sullivan climbed into his TBF Avenger that morning, he felt a confidence he hadn't experienced since the early days of the war. The aircraft itself was also improved. The TBF-1C model featured additional armor protection, more powerful engines, and better defensive armament. But it was the torpedo hanging beneath the fuselage that made all the difference. "This is it, boys," Sullivan called over the radio as the squadron formed up for the attack. "Today, we find out if 3 years of getting shot to pieces was worth it. If these new fish work like they're supposed to, we're going to give the Japanese Navy a very bad day." The flight to the target took 2 hours, crossing hundreds of miles of empty Pacific Ocean under partly cloudy skies that provided perfect cover for the approaching American aircraft. Sullivan's radar operator, aviation radio man First Class Pete Eyes Morrison, kept up a steady commentary on the tactical situation as they approached the convoy's estimated position. "Skipper, I've got multiple contacts bearing 315 degrees, range approximately 40 miles, Morrison reported. "Looks like a large formation, probably our friends." Sullivan felt his pulse quicken as they approached their target. In a few minutes, they would know whether the new Mark 13 torpedoes would finally give American naval aviation the weapon it needed to dominate the Pacific. After 3 years of failure and frustration, they were about to discover if the war's most notorious weapon had finally been fixed. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Japanese had started the war with the world's most effective torpedo, the Type 93 Long Lance, that had devastated Allied naval forces in numerous night battles. American submarines had struggled with their own torpedo problems for the first 2 years of the war, finally achieving success only after their Mark 14s were completely redesigned. Now it was the aviators' turn to discover if American engineering could finally produce a reliable aerial torpedo. As the Japanese convoy appeared on the horizon, Sullivan began his final approach knowing that within minutes he would either validate 3 years of development work or add another failure to the Mark 13's dismal record. Either way, he and his squadron were about to write another chapter in the Pacific War's ongoing story of technological innovation and human courage. Part 2. The perfect storm. The Japanese convoy spread across the horizon like a steel constellation, its formation precise and disciplined despite the growing threat from American air power. From 8,000 feet, Sullivan could see the classic defensive pattern. The 6 transport ships arranged in 2 columns with the heavy cruisers Kumano and Suzuya positioned on the flanks, while 4 destroyers wove protective patterns around the formation's perimeter. "Skipper, look at all that flak," muttered Lieutenant Bob Deacon Williams over the radio. Williams was the squadron's most experienced pilot after Sullivan, a former seminary student from Georgia who joined the Navy after Pearl Harbor. He'd survived the carnage at Guadalcanal and knew exactly what they were flying into. The Japanese were ready for them. Black puffs of anti-aircraft fire were already beginning to dot the sky around the American formation, and Sullivan could see the distinctive shapes of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters climbing to intercept them. The convoy's commander wasn't taking any chances. He deployed his combat air patrol in a layered defense that would force the American torpedo bombers to fight their way through multiple waves of opposition. But Sullivan wasn't worried about the fighters. The Grumman F-6F Hellcats from VF-18 were already moving to engage the Zeros, their superior altitude and speed giving them a significant tactical advantage. What concerned him was the wall of anti-aircraft fire that was beginning to fill sky ahead of them. The Japanese had learned to coordinate their defensive fire, creating interlocking zones of destruction that had torn apart countless American attack formations. "All right, people, this is what we've been training for," Sullivan called over the radio. "New tactics, new weapons, new war. Brooklyn, you take the lead transport in the port column. Deacon, you've got the second ship. I'll take the heavy cruiser on the starboard side." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of the traditional coordinated attack that bunched all the torpedo bombers together in a single vulnerable formation, they would attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The improved Mark 13s could be dropped from higher altitudes, allowing the pilots to begin their attack runs from positions that would have been impossible with the old torpedoes. Lieutenant Kowalski was flying his 3rd combat mission, but his first torpedo attack. The young pilot from Brooklyn had trained extensively with the new Mark 13s, but training was very different from combat. As he began his attack run on the lead transport, a 10,000-ton cargo ship loaded with reinforcements for the Japanese garrison at Leyte, he could feel his heart pounding against his ribs. "Steady, Brooklyn," Sullivan's voice came through his headphones. "Remember your training. Altitude 250 feet, speed 200 knots, release range 1,000 yards. The fish will do the rest." The anti-aircraft fire was getting heavier as they descended, the familiar black puffs of exploding shells creating a deadly obstacle course that had to be navigated with split-second timing. But the new attack profile meant they weren't trapped in the low-level death trap that had claimed so many previous torpedo attacks. At 250 feet, they were still vulnerable to the heaviest guns, but they were above the worst of the small-caliber fire that had shredded so many TBF Avengers in the past. Kowalski's target was growing larger in his bomb sight, the Japanese transport zigzagging desperately as its crew realized they were under attack. But the ship was too large and too slow to avoid a properly aimed torpedo, and Kowalski had trained for months to make this exact shot. As he reached the optimal release point, he toggled his bomb bay doors and felt the familiar lurch as the Mark 13 dropped away from his aircraft. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The torpedo fell toward the water, its stabilizing fins deploying automatically as it reached the proper angle. In the past, this had been the moment of greatest anxiety for American torpedo bomber pilots. Would the weapon survive the impact with the water? Would its guidance system function properly? Would the warhead explode when it reached its target? The Mark 13 hit the water cleanly, its improved air vessel absorbing the impact without damage. The torpedo's engine started immediately, its propeller spinning up to full speed as the weapon began its run toward the Japanese transport. Unlike the erratic performance of earlier models, this torpedo ran straight and true, its improved gyroscopic system keeping it on course despite the target's evasive maneuvers. "Holy is actually working," Kowalski shouted over the radio, forgetting proper communications protocol in his excitement. The torpedo was visible in the water, its wake pointing like an arrow toward the desperately maneuvering transport ship. Sullivan was making his own attack run on the heavy cruiser Kumano, one of Japan's most powerful warships. The cruiser was putting up a tremendous volume of anti-aircraft fire, its multiple gun mounts creating a steel curtain that filled the sky with deadly fragments. But Sullivan had been through this before, and he knew how to read the patterns of defensive fire. The key was timing and unpredictability. The Japanese gunners were trained to track aircraft flying in straight lines at constant altitudes. By varying his approach, climbing, diving, turning slightly left and right, Sullivan could throw off their aim just enough to survive long enough to deliver his weapon. It was a deadly game of three-dimensional chess played at 200 miles per hour. As he reached his release point, Sullivan could see Japanese sailors on the cruiser's deck, some manning anti-aircraft guns while others scrambled for cover. The ship was beautiful in its way, a masterpiece of naval architecture and engineering that represented decades of Japanese shipbuilding expertise. In a few seconds, he was going to try to destroy it. The Mark 13 dropped cleanly from his bomb bay, and Sullivan immediately pulled into a sharp climbing turn to avoid the concentrated anti-aircraft fire. As he looked back over his shoulder, he could see his torpedo entering the water and beginning his run toward the cruiser. Unlike so many previous attacks, this weapon was performing exactly as designed. Lieutenant Williams was attacking the second transport in the formation, a slightly smaller vessel that appeared to be carrying military vehicles and supplies. The ship's crew had learned from watching the attack on the lead transport, and they were throwing everything they had at the approaching American aircraft. Tracers filled the air around Williams' TBF, and he could hear the distinctive sound of bullets striking his aircraft's armor plating. But Williams had been through worse. During the Guadalcanal campaign, he'd flown through anti-aircraft fire so heavy that it looked like a solid wall of steel. This was dangerous, but it wasn't the worst he'd seen. More importantly, he had confidence in his weapon for the first time in his combat career. The Mark 13 performed flawlessly, entering the water at the optimal angle and immediately beginning its run toward the target. Williams pulled up and away from the convoy, already thinking about the return flight to the Intrepid. But as he climbed to rejoin the formation, he couldn't resist looking back to see the results of their attack. The first explosion came from Kowalski's target. The Mark 13's magnetic influence exploder detected the transport's steel hull and detonated the 600-pound Torpex warhead directly beneath the ship's keel. The explosion was tremendous, lifting the vessel's bow completely out of the water and breaking its back in a shower of steel and flame. The transport began sinking immediately, its cargo of troops and supplies disappearing beneath the Pacific swells. "I got him! I got him!" Kowalski was shouting over the radio, his excitement infectious despite the continuing anti-aircraft fire. "The son of a is going down." Sullivan's torpedo struck the heavy cruiser Kumano amidships, the magnetic exploder functioning perfectly to detonate the warhead at the optimal position. The cruiser shuddered under the impact, its port side blown open by the explosion. Within minutes, the ship was listing heavily to port as thousands of tons of seawater poured through the gaping hole in its hull. But it was Williams' attack that produced the most spectacular results. His Mark 13 struck the second transport just as the ship was attempting an emergency turn to avoid the torpedo. The explosion occurred directly beneath the vessel's fuel tanks, creating a secondary blast that sent a pillar of fire hundreds of feet into the air. The transport didn't just sink, it disintegrated, leaving only burning debris scattered across the ocean's surface. "Did you see that?" Williams called over the radio. "The whole ship just disappeared." The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and profound. For the American pilots, it was vindication after 3 years of flying with defective weapons. For the first time since the war began, their torpedoes were performing as designed, turning their suicidal attacks into devastating strikes against Japanese shipping. For the Japanese, it was a shocking reversal of fortune. They had grown accustomed to American torpedo attacks that rarely succeeded, often watching enemy aircraft sacrifice themselves for weapons that failed to explode. Suddenly, American torpedo bombers were sinking their ships with ruthless efficiency, using weapons that worked exactly as intended. The convoy's remaining ships scattered in panic, abandoning their careful defensive formation in favor of individual escape attempts. But the damage was already done. 3 ships were gone, including one of Japan's most powerful heavy cruisers, and Sullivan's squadron had demonstrated that American naval aviation finally possessed a reliable torpedo weapon. As VT-18 formed up for the return flight to the Intrepid, Sullivan couldn't help but feel a sense of professional satisfaction. After 3 years of frustrated attacks and weapon failures, American torpedo bombers could finally deliver on their promise. The Mark 13 Mod 4 wasn't just a weapon, it was vindication for every pilot who had died making attacks with defective torpedoes. All aircraft, this is Razor, Sullivan called over the radio. Outstanding work, people. Let's go home and get ready to do it again. But as they flew back toward their carrier, Sullivan knew that this was just the beginning. The Japanese Navy still had hundreds of ships scattered across the Pacific, and now American torpedo bombers finally had the weapon they needed to hunt them down. The balance of power in the Pacific War had just shifted decisively in America's favor. Part 3. The hunters, unleashed 3 weeks after their successful attack on the Leyte convoy, VT-18, found themselves hunting bigger game. The intelligence briefing aboard the USS Intrepid revealed a target that would have been considered suicidal just months earlier. A Japanese task force centered around the battleship Yamashiro, attempting to break through American naval forces in Leyte Gulf. "Gentlemen, this is what we've been waiting for," Commander Harrison announced to the assembled aircrew. "Admiral Nishimura's southern force is attempting to penetrate Leyte Gulf through Surigao Strait. The task force includes 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers. Our job is to slow them down before they reach the main battle line." Sullivan studied the reconnaissance photographs spread across the briefing table. The Yamashiro was a formidable opponent, a 30,000-ton dreadnought battleship armed with 12 14-inch guns and protected by armor belts up to 12 inches thick. Under normal circumstances, attacking such a target with torpedo bombers would be considered virtually impossible. But these weren't normal circumstances. The Mark 13 Mod 4 had transformed American torpedo bombing from a desperate gamble into a precision weapon system. In the 3 weeks since their first successful attack, VT-18 had sunk 14 Japanese vessels, including 3 cruisers and a destroyer. More importantly, they hadn't lost a single aircraft to weapon malfunction. Every Mark 13 they dropped had performed exactly as designed. Lieutenant Kowalski had become something of a celebrity within the squadron, his enthusiastic reports of successful torpedo attacks spreading throughout the air group. The young pilot from Brooklyn had developed an almost mystical confidence in the Mark 13, treating each mission like a guaranteed success rather than a potentially suicidal gamble. "Skipper, what's the approach going to be like?" Kowalski asked as they studied the tactical situation. "Those battleships are going to put up one of a defensive barrage." Sullivan nodded grimly. Japanese battleships carried some of the heaviest anti-aircraft armaments in the world, with multiple gun mounts capable of creating devastating fields of fire. The Yamashiro alone mounted 24 25mm anti-aircraft guns, along with numerous smaller weapons designed specifically to destroy low-flying aircraft. "The difference is that we don't have to fly through the worst of it anymore," Sullivan explained. "With the new Mark 13s, we can attack from 300 feet and 1,500 yards range. That keeps us above most of the light stuff and gives us more time to maneuver." The tactical revolution represented by the improved Mark 13 couldn't be overstated. The old torpedoes had required pilots to fly straight and level at wave-top height, often for several miles, presenting perfect targets for Japanese gunners. The new weapons could be dropped from higher altitudes and longer ranges, allowing pilots to use evasive maneuvers throughout their attack runs. Chief O'Brien and his maintenance crew had been working around the clock to keep the squadron's aircraft combat ready. The improved reliability of the Mark 13 meant they were flying more missions and attacking more targets than ever before. Instead of the frustrating cycle of failed attacks and weapon malfunctions, They were achieving consistent success that justified the massive effort required to maintain a carrier-based torpedo squadron. "These new fish are a maintenance man's dream," O'Brien told his crew as they loaded fresh Mark 13s onto the TBF Avengers. "No more babying them through pre-flight checks. No more wondering if the things are going to work. They're reliable as clockwork." The flight to intercept Admiral Nishimura's task force took place in the pre-dawn darkness of October 25, 1944. Sullivan handled 18 TBF Avengers through the night sky, guided by radar contacts that showed the Japanese ship steaming steadily toward their rendezvous with Destiny in Surigao Strait. As the sun began to rise behind them, the American pilots could see their targets silhouetted against the western horizon. The Japanese task force was maintaining its formation despite the growing threat from American air and naval forces. Admiral Nishimura apparently determined to break through the Leyte Gulf regardless of the cost. "There she is, boys," Sullivan called over the radio as the battleship Yamashiro came into view. 30,000 tons of Japanese steel, and she's all ours." The battleship was a magnificent sight, her pagoda-style superstructure rising above her massive gun turrets like a steel mountain. She was steaming at high speed, her way cutting a white line across the dark water as her crew prepared for the battle they knew was coming. Within hours, she would encounter Admiral Oldendorf's battle line in Surigao Strait. But first, she had to survive the attention of VT-18. The Japanese had learned from their previous encounters with American torpedo bombers, and they were ready. As soon as the TBF Avengers were spotted, every gun in the task force opened fire, creating a wall of anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with deadly steel fragments. But the Americans had learned too, and their new tactics were specifically designed to counter Japanese defensive measures. Instead of attacking in a single wave that could be concentrated upon by all the enemy guns, Sullivan split his squadron into 3 separate groups attacking from different directions. The Mark 13's improved performance envelope allowed this kind of tactical flexibility, enabling coordinated attacks that would have been impossible with the old torpedoes. Lieutenant Commander Deacon Williams led the first attack group against the heavy cruiser Mogami, while Lieutenant Junior Grade Kowalski took his division after one of the destroyers. Sullivan reserved the battleship Yamashiro for himself, leading 6 TBF Avengers in a complex approach that would bring them within torpedo range, while minimizing their exposure to the ship's heaviest guns. The attack began at 0630 hours, with Williams' group diving toward the Mogami from the north. The heavy cruiser was putting up tremendous defensive fire, her multiple gun mounts creating overlapping zones of destruction that had to be navigated with split-second timing. But the improved Mark 13s meant the American pilots didn't have to fly straight and level through the worst of the barrage. Williams released his torpedo from 250 feet and immediately pulled into a sharp climbing turn, using his aircraft's superior maneuverability to avoid the concentrated anti-aircraft fire. His Mark 13 entered the water cleanly and began its run toward the cruiser, its magnetic guidance system keeping it on course despite the target's evasive maneuvers. The explosion when the torpedo struck was visible for miles, a tremendous blast that lifted the Mogami's stern out of the water and broke her keel. The cruiser began sinking immediately, her crew abandoning ship as thousands of tons of seawater poured through the gaping hole in her hull. Kowalski's attack on the destroyer Shigeru was even more spectacular. The smaller warship was incredibly agile, capable of turning almost on its own length as it attempted to avoid the incoming torpedo. But the Mark 13's improved guidance system was designed to handle exactly this kind of target, automatically adjusting its course to compensate for the destroyer's evasive maneuvers. "Got him!" Kowalski shouted over the radio as his torpedo struck the destroyer amidships. The explosion broke the 2,000-ton warship in half, sending both sections to the bottom within minutes. But it was Sullivan's attack on the Yamashiro that demonstrated the full potential of the improved Mark 13. The battleship was the most heavily defended target in the Japanese task force, her massive anti-aircraft armament creating a steel curtain that had protected her from numerous previous attacks. But Sullivan had been studying Japanese defensive tactics for 3 years, and he knew how to exploit their weaknesses. The key was timing and coordination. Instead of attacking from a single direction, Sullivan brought his 6 aircraft in from 3 different angles simultaneously, forcing the Japanese gunners to divide their fire among multiple targets. The Mark 13's improved performance envelope made this kind of coordinated attack possible for the first time in the Pacific War. Sullivan's torpedo struck the Yamashiro just forward of her main armor belt, the magnetic exploder detonating the 600-pound warhead at exactly the right moment to achieve maximum damage. The explosion flooded the battleship's forward compartments, giving her a pronounced list to starboard that slowed her speed and made her an even better target for follow-up attacks. 2 more Mark 13s struck the crippled battleship within minutes, their explosions tearing massive holes in her hull and flooding her engineering spaces. The Yamashiro began settling by the bow, her crew fighting desperately to save their ship even as it became clear that she was doomed. "Skipper, look at her burn," called Lieutenant Peterson, one of the newer pilots who had joined the squadron just weeks earlier. The battleship was indeed burning, her superstructure wreathed in flames as secondary explosions rocked her hull. Within 30 minutes of the first torpedo strike, the Yamashiro was gone, taking with her over 1,400 officers and men. It was the first Japanese battleship sunk by aerial torpedo attack in the Pacific War, a victory that would have been impossible without the reliable Mark 13 Mod 4. As VT-18 formed up for the return flight to the Intrepid, Sullivan couldn't help but reflect on how dramatically the war had changed. Just months earlier, American torpedo bombers had been considered little more than suicide weapons, flying obsolete aircraft armed with defective torpedoes. Now they were the most feared anti-ship weapon in the Pacific, capable of sinking any vessel in the Japanese Navy. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by the Japanese. Radio intercepts revealed growing panic among Japanese naval commanders as they struggled to counter the suddenly effective American torpedo bombers. Ships that had previously ignored torpedo attacks were now taking desperate evasive action, breaking formation and abandoning their missions rather than face the deadly Mark 13s. "All aircraft, this is Razor," Sullivan called over the radio as they headed back toward their carrier. "Outstanding work, people. I think we just changed the course of the war." He was right. The Battle of Surigao Strait would go down in history as one of the most decisive naval engagements of World War II, and the destruction of Admiral Nishimura's southern force by American torpedo bombers would be remembered as the moment when American naval aviation finally achieved its full potential. But for the men of VT-18, it was simply another successful mission with weapons that finally worked as designed. After 3 years of frustration and failure, American torpedo bombers had become the instrument of Japanese naval destruction they were always meant to be. Part 4. The Great Reckoning. By December 1944, the Japanese Navy was in full retreat across the Pacific, and VT-18 was at the forefront of the hunt. The reliable Mark 13 torpedo had transformed American carrier aviation from a supporting player into the primary anti-ship weapon system of the Pacific Fleet. What had once been considered suicidal missions were now routine operations, with success rates that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Sullivan stood on the flight deck of the USS Intrepid as she steamed through the Philippinesia, watching his crew prepare for what intelligence promised would be their biggest target yet: the remnants of the Japanese combined fleet attempting to escape from the Philippines to safer waters around the Japanese home islands. "Skipper, you need to see this," called Lieutenant Morrison, the squadron's intelligence officer, as he approached with a folder of reconnaissance photographs. "The Japanese are moving everything they have left: battleships, carriers, cruisers, the works. It's like they're abandoning the Philippines entirely." Sullivan studied the aerial photographs, his experience cataloging enemy vessels scattered across dozens of square miles of ocean. There were at least 40 ships in the formation, including some of Japan's most powerful remaining warships. Under the old torpedo bombing doctrine, attacking such a heavily defended formation would have been tantamount to suicide. With the Mark 13 Mod 4, it was an opportunity. The strategic situation in December 1944 was unprecedented in naval warfare. The Japanese Navy, once the most powerful maritime force in the Pacific, had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. The reliable American torpedoes had played a crucial role in this transformation, sinking Japanese vessels faster than they could be replaced and forcing the enemy to abandon aggressive operations in favor of desperate defensive measures. Lieutenant Kowalski had become VT-18's leading ace, with confirmed sinks of 2 cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 7 transport vessels. The young pilot from Brooklyn had developed an almost supernatural ability to place his Mark 13s exactly where they would do the most damage, exploiting weaknesses in Japanese ship design that had been identified through months of successful attacks. "Brooklyn, what's your assessment of that formation?" Sullivan asked, handing over the reconnaissance photos. Kowalski studied the images with the eye of an experienced ship killer. "They're running scared, Skipper. Look at the formation. No proper screening, escorts scattered all over the place. They're not expecting to fight. They're just trying to get home in one piece." The transformation in Japanese naval tactics had been dramatic and revealing. Early in the war, Japanese ships had maintained tight, disciplined formations designed to maximize their defensive firepower and mutual support. Now they were sailing in loose, irregular patterns that suggested panic and disorganization rather than tactical planning. Chief O'Brien's maintenance crew had been working overtime to keep pace with the increased operational tempo. The reliable Mark 13s meant that VT-18 was flying more missions and engaging more targets than any torpedo squadron in naval history. Aircraft that might have been grounded for days waiting for replacement torpedoes were now turning around within hours. "Ready for the next mission, sir. We've got every bird ready to fly," O'Brien reported as he completed his pre-flight inspection of the squadron's TBF Avengers. 18 aircraft, 18 Mark 13s, all systems green. "These new fish have made my job of a lot easier." The mission briefing revealed a target list that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. VT-18 would be attacking in coordination with 3 other torpedo squadrons, 60 aircraft total carrying the most reliable anti-ship weapons in the world. Their primary targets included the battleship Eyes, the heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma, and a dozen destroyers and escort vessels. "Gentlemen, this may be our chance to finish off the Japanese Navy once and for all," Commander Harrison announced to the assembled aircrew. "Intelligence estimates that approximately 70% of Japan's remaining naval strength is concentrated in this one formation. If we can sink even half of these ships, the Japanese won't have enough vessels left to conduct major naval operations." The scale of the operation was unprecedented in carrier aviation history. 4 squadrons of torpedo bombers, supported by fighters and dive bombers, would converge on the Japanese formation from multiple directions in a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm even the most sophisticated defensive measures. The reliable Mark 13s made such complex operations possible for the first time. Sullivan's tactical plan reflected 3 years of hard-won experience fighting with defective weapons and the recent months of success with reliable torpedoes. Instead of the mass formations that he had proven so vulnerable to Japanese defensive fire, his aircraft would attack in small groups from multiple directions, using the Mark 13's improved performance envelope to maintain tactical flexibility throughout the engagement. "Remember, people, we're not the same squadron that got shot to pieces at Guadalcanal," Sullivan reminded his pilots during the final briefing. "We've got reliable weapons, proven tactics, and 3 years of combat experience. The Japanese should be afraid of us, not the other way around." The launch began at 0500 hours, with 60 TBF Avengers taking off from 4 different carriers in the pre-dawn darkness. The formation required precise navigation